okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice day out, huh?
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
I love this time of year. It's my favorite time of year by far. Everything's changing so quick. And
Yeah.
green sprouts starting to shoot on the trees and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a shame what's going on right now, though.
It's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody ready to go? Okay, let me start with a lot of different news today, as you probably saw in the daily briefing. First of all, I'm incredibly sad for the tragic loss of another city resident, as you heard. It's the fourth person that's died of COVID-19. This individual was a resident of one of our most vulnerable populations, and a second in the 2 quarantine buildings for our elderly. Now each building has lost a resident, and I'm just hoping it doesn't spread to any more buildings. These are 2 losses too many. We got to find ways to really protect this precious population. I'm grateful that more testing and drive-through facilities are finally being initiated, and I hope that the new federal Phase 4 funding package that is just getting through to the Congress today will be helpful. It promises cities will have more testing resources, and those are desperately needed, so we can give the tools to the public health experts so they can really do their job. I also hope that more broad-based testing will provide a lot more information to the public, and that information will be divulged. As you see in Franklin County, they publish the number of cases in each municipality and these sorts of things. I really think we can do even a better job if we really understood where the concentrations lie. And if we don't use this federal funding for more testing very quickly, it'll just be a travesty. As you know, I've been asking for a voluntary measure to ensure that we don't spread disease from one of our infected elderly homes to another. I can't get that approval from the state yet. I certainly understand the staffing consequences of trying to request that people don't work at one nursing facility and then work to another nursing facility and potentially take that infection along with them. You know how vulnerable that population is. That's the single biggest growth area by far for deaths, not only in New York, but across the country and in Vermont as well. At the same time, a lot of our hospitals are laying off professional healthcare workers. And Glens Falls Hospital just laid off 300 healthcare workers. So wouldn't it be amazing if we could figure out how these laid off healthcare workers could somehow start helping with our nursing population? We need to figure out a better way to protect that really vulnerable population. We also need to do more for contact tracing. I understand that the president's now talking about creating up to 80 contact tracers for a county of our size. And I think we've got less than half those resources currently. I'd like to see more of those resources become available. And again, we're furloughing workers that we don't have work for. There's another job that some of our experienced clerks could perhaps, and caseworkers could actually do, help us with contact tracing. It's a really big part of the testing regimen. And we really need to kind of put all our politics aside right now and consider this kind of a Rosie the Riveter moment like we saw in World War II, where just everybody comes together and helps to solve this. I know it's hard for us all. That you saw my mention earlier in the week that even if we assume that for every one person we know who's infected, there's another dozen out there still lurking that we don't know have been infected, and they're the silent, asymptomatic carriers that you hear all about. Let's say for every one we know about, there's 12, a whole dozen that we don't know about. That still represents only 1% of our population. That means 99% of our population is still vulnerable. We can't stop doing this. We've got to redouble our effort. We have to do even more if we don't want to lose any lives. And I'm absolutely not going to give up. Obviously, we're making some very, very tough decisions. You've been following the tough decisions of furloughing that we're making in the city ourselves, and you probably heard that the county is now making those decisions. Matter of fact, every municipality across the state, I'm sure, is contemplating what we did. We're putting in place furloughs. that will last until the end of July. Of those furloughs, it was agreed that we would furlough people that we have every expectation to having returned by the end of July. Some of that will be dependent on when the governor lifts his pause order. And I don't know when that will be. As you know, the pause order now goes at least to May 15th, but I expect it's going to be extended again. And that will, once that order is lifted, we can start bringing back some of our workers that would normally work in this building, work with customers, et cetera. And obviously they can't do that from home. We've got about 40 employees in total working from home, some more effectively than others. Some jobs just don't lend any opportunity to work from home, and those people are essentially idle. And then others we would bring back as our budget improves and as the need for their services improve. We do a lot of seasonal work. For instance, road repair occurs in certain parts of the season. And as budget improves and as we need to bring them back, we'll bring them back too. All the residents of the city, and certainly the city itself, is taking big hits on both our health and our well-being. I'm really discouraged that a senior U.S. Senate leader has recently said that rather than expecting any relief and help for our municipalities across the country, maybe we should just go bankrupt. I am not going to supervise the bankruptcy of the city of Plattsburgh. That's absolutely not going to happen. We need to ensure that we have our first responders, our quick, fast first responders, our quality of life, our wonderful amenities, and we've got very cheap and renewable energy for our residents that I'm not going to sacrifice by declaring bankruptcy. You know, there's only really two types of cities in the world. Those have the quality of life and the cheap energy we have, and those that wish they had. And I'm not going to sacrifice that, nor negate all the obligations that the city's made to past retirees, et cetera, just over this invisible virus. We're going to do absolutely everything we can to preserve the city. And finally, one last concern I have is that some renters who are in group homes, recovery homes, et cetera, have been evicted. That's not an issue that really the city of Plattsburgh can do anything about. That's a civil matter between them and the landlords. But I really hope we don't compound any suffering that is currently going on. I've had a number of people write in and ask questions for today, so let's see if I can just quickly get to those before your questions. There's a question about the actual composition of the people being furloughed. There's currently 31 furloughs or layoffs. The only difference in furlough is layoffs is whether we expect to be able to bring them back by the terms of the furlough, which is July 31st. So there's only 7 of that group that we can't make any commitment to bring them back by July 31st. The rest, the vast majority, 80% of them are furloughs. And that, for the furloughed population, I read an article today that many of them will actually receive a higher income, ironically enough, on a furlough than they do from employment, because remember, they're eligible for that $600 automatic federal grant as well. And it carries with it full health care benefits. That was one of the big concerns, that we didn't want to leave our furloughed employees high and dry with regard to that. So it's well below the number of 61 or 62 that you were seeing in the social media, where that was a number that was always false. It was for positions that we don't control. It was for people that were or lines that were already vacated, that are that we had no intention of filling anyway in these circumstances. So it comes down to 31 total employees. And obviously in the last 5 weeks, as we've been discussing this, we've been having negotiations with, first of all, work everything out with the department heads for who those individuals ought to be, or these lines would ought to be, and then with the unions for who the people associated with those lines ought to be, because they have their own rules for seniority and all that sort of stuff. Keep your hand up on a question with regard to the first one. Okay.
Sorry.
I did have a quick question on
Yep.
that. Sorry to interrupt. You said it was 31 total employees. That's with the layoffs and the furloughs?
Correct. And there
Okay.
might be another couple of managers, but with the managers, we're hoping to rearrange their contracts. We've got a couple of managers that are retiring, for instance, so that won't require any sort of job action. They're making that choice voluntarily, fully voluntarily. Let's see. I think that's all the questions there. And as I mentioned, as the pause ends and as work comes back before July 31, presumably we'll be bringing many of those employees back. I had a question. One of our firefighter, our fire chief and our police captain, after a meeting yesterday, were conferring in their car. They work very closely, obviously, together, are considered cohorts. One had his mask on, the other's mask had fallen down. A reporter had asked about that. Obviously, we would like them to be using their mask and conversing with each other. We're grateful that one had their mask on. I've instructed them, and they of course agreed to that. There was a question on an individual employee that was let go as a part of a disciplinary action some months ago. We're not able to complete the hearings for that individual. I'll read you a statement because it actually hasn't come to me, but the question was, how much is it costing the city for that employee? It's about $5,000 a month, and I'll let you know how this process works. This was following the arrest and something called an adjournment and contemplation of dismissal of a firefighter, Mr. Favreau, that was charged and arrested and arraigned for domestic violence. He had then worked out an agreement between his lawyer, defendant, and the prosecution. They agreed to something called adjournment in contemplation of dismissal. That is kind of like, in some sense, kind of like a suspended sentence. If you don't do any of the same sort of act in the next year, then your record is expunged. However, he's exercised his right to a hearing, and of course I respect that decision. The city obviously takes any allegation of domestic violence very seriously, and I trust that the process in place in the collective bargaining agreement will protect all involved parties. In the meantime, until the firefighter has his opportunity to represent his position in front of a hearing officer, that individual's pay is on paid leave as part of their collective bargaining agreement. And we don't suffer at all. He's got a right to take advantage of that process. Unfortunately, it places quite a burden on the taxpayers because we have to pay that salary, but it certainly is fully mandated within his rights. And then once a final decision is made, and I don't know how long it'll take for that decision to be made because hearing officers are assigned by the state and it takes a while for that hearing officer to be appointed. And right now with social distancing, no hearings are going on. So we're essentially left paying that check every month. But once he completes all his due process, that will be the only time I will actually be involved. None of this has actually come to my desk at this point. It's all between him and his supervisor. And so it'd be inappropriate for me to comment until I've seen the whole hearing report. That's the only evidence I'll be looking at, the report from the hearing officer. So that's an outstanding issue that people have been asking about. So I think that's all the questions that have come to me. Do you have any questions, I'm sure, of your own?
Yeah, so the 4 people, is that whole desk in the Plattsburgh area alone, or is that county?
I'm afraid I don't know that information. I know at least 2 of the people are in City of Plattsburgh elderly housing residences. And as you know, you've heard me talk many times before about just how gravely concerned I am of that.
Mm-hmm.
What I would like to be able to do is have that data. So we could then, if we know that we've got a greater incidence of infection within the city, as you know, we already put in the first nursing home protection back in that press conference back on March 12th. And we put in social distancing back then. We put in face mask policies, all the curfews, all these policies. If there's anything more we can do, because we understand the gravity of this, if there's anything more we can do, we will do it. But it really helps for us to know just how serious that problem is. I'm assuming it's very, very serious, but it could be extremely serious. We don't quite know because we don't have that data. Now, Franklin County, every day they publish a picture that shows exactly how many cases are in each municipality within the county. And I think if we saw that data, I believe we would find that 90% or 80%, maybe 90% of the quarantine orders are within the city of Plattsburgh, even though the city only represents about 25% of the population of the entire county. And it makes sense. The city is very dense and the counties are quite rural. So you're going to expect a much higher concentration of infections within the city. So that's why we put in place that 100-person task force that includes all of our police officers. All of our firefighters are out whenever they can to try to educate the public, and especially in the nursing homes. all of our code enforcement officers, liaison officers from each of our various departments, a medical professional associated with the fire department who's a doctor, and such. We've got this 100-person team because we understand the stakes are very high. But without really complete information, we're afraid that there's things that we could have done if only we'd known. For instance, if we know that there's a case, a positive, in one of our elderly homes, even if it hasn't gotten to the point of quarantines, etc., we could send a lot of our resources in there to start protecting and hardening that facility. Without knowing it until after the quarantine has already occurred, I feel we're missing that 7-day opportunity when something may go from a positive case to a full quarantine. So that's why information is so vitally important, and it's just not information that we have, unfortunately.
Okay. And are those senior homes the one on Flynn Ave?
Correct.
Okay.
The 2 adjoining homes, 1 in each home, from what I understand. I haven't seen the actual data and the individuals involved, as I mentioned,
Right.
but I believe it's 1 from each of those facilities.
Yeah.
I'm fearful that there may be a positive and possibly a quarantine in 1 more. Again, we don't know for sure, but I'm monitoring as best I possibly can through as many different sources as I can so we can guard against that.
Now, have you reached out to the Clinton County Health Department to try and get more, information available?
I have. I've been told that they're not permitted to release it to me.
Okay.
But first of all, as you know from all of our other press conferences, the Clinton County Health Department are my heroes. They're really out there. They understand the importance of testing. They understand the importance of contact tracing. They understand the value of these drive-in centers that I'm hopeful we can maybe get in the next couple of weeks if the promises that have been made to us at the federal level come true. They really get it. They really understand that we need to be doing so much more. And if I'm pulling my hair out over all this, they are too. They're absolutely desperately concerned, as the people of the hospital are too. We're all in this together. We need to really look at it that way.
Thank you.
Anything to say for people who are getting really antsy and the nice weather is coming in and they just want to leave home? I think people, just make sure people aren't letting up right now.
Oh, people can't let up. I know how hard it is. It's hard on all of us, but we can't let up. As you know, I use the example where it may be the case that 99% of us have never been exposed to this yet. If we let up, there's not much of a difference in the rate of spread of this infection if 99% or 100% are vulnerable, like we had 100% are vulnerable a month ago or a month and a half ago. Now we have 99% vulnerable. In other words, we're just about as vulnerable as before. If we let up, we're right back, right into the middle of this thing with people in the hospital and intensive care with ventilators. We can't afford to have that happen. Each life is really, really precious. Each life has a huge value to us. And as much as we're hurting economically and financially, and the city's hurting financially, etc., those numbers absolutely pale in comparison to even the loss of a single life. So yeah, it's very, very tough. But I believe people, if they're given the full information, they don't get despondent. They're going to get resolved. They're going to say, okay, look at the progress we're making here. Look at the fact that we don't, because of the very early things we did in the city of Plattsburgh, we don't have that same real growth that you're seeing in Warren County and St. Lawrence County. Warren and St. Lawrence and Jefferson County had all about the same numbers a few weeks ago. Now their numbers are twice ours. And the reason is, or 3 times ours, the reason is we got right in there with social distancing, nursing home hardening, face masks, etc., so much earlier than they did, unfortunately, and it's saving lives. So if we can save half a dozen or a dozen or 2 dozen lives or 3 dozen lives at the end of this, all of our financial struggles are going to be worth it, I believe. But people have to do that calculation for themselves. That's my position. Any further questions?
I don't know if you can answer this, but what was kind of, what happened leading up to having to furlough or lay off workers? What was, I guess, the monetary situation that you guys had to do that?
Well, about 5 weeks ago, we started sitting down and trying to understand, first of all, obviously the health effects of this. We spent an awful lot of time doing that, and emergency orders and all the things that you've seen. But also the effect on our financial health as well, where we were most vulnerable. And we pretty quickly came up with a picture of where our most vulnerable revenue sources were and where we're going to incur greater costs in COVID-19 preparation, in higher pension costs because of the state pension systems vested in the stock market, et cetera. And we came up with a number of about potential damage to the city of around $7 million out of a $23 million budget. So that's a huge chunk, that's what, 30% or so. And then we said, but there's no way we can do $7 million. And maybe some could argue that that's a worst case scenario, so let's cut it in half. That's one of the exercises one of my mayor pro tem did with his finance committee. I looked at it from a different approach and came up with a pretty similar number. So we said, at least for what we know now, that is what we got to aim for. Now, some of those numbers have actually gotten worse since we've spoken last. You may have seen the governor's slide from a few days ago that said, hey, listen, if when I go down to Washington in a couple of days and they don't give this state a lot of money to bail it out for the $10 to $15 billion hole they have, I've got no choice but to decrease money coming to the individual localities by 20%. So we only had 10% reduction there. Now we have 20% from every indication. So if anything, this hole is getting bigger. And to be blunt, the steps we're taking right now aren't going to fill that hole. It's going to help fill that hole. It's going to put us in a better position to dig deeper if we have to, but it does by no means solve the whole extent of the problem. But it is very important. If we've got 40 employees at home, some of them with little or no work to do, and we've got a government program where they would actually end up making more money relying on the federal stimulus package and still have their benefits and help save some of our precious cash flow that is very quickly dwindling down, that just seems like good common sense. So it's a difficult proposition. As you know, we did that very publicly. You heard our first announcement a few weeks ago that when our calculation looks like we have about $3.5 million hole. You know that we've been working ever since with individual departments and collections of departments. We've had probably a dozen or 2 dozen meetings. Once we came up with a list from the department heads of the reductions, and you saw that list at the recent council meeting, that we're required to have all the discussions in public, had an open session, a 2-hour meeting to discuss those. We all witnesses, it's all on YouTube. And that's the way we were told that we're required to do this. And then the next step is with those positions, we don't list the actual people. Then we go and negotiate with the unions for which person would you like to attach to this title. Do you want it to be seniority? In some cases, they want the most senior person to have the opportunity to go on a furlough and collect full pay. Other unions want the least senior person. So that's been occurring ever since last Thursday, all those discussions. Now, since then, you may have seen that Clinton County is going through the same exercise. They did theirs in an executive session. They came out of executive session. I don't know if I've not been able to see that. I'm just reflecting what I've heard because by the end of executive session, the public's all gone home, et cetera. And they voted to do something pretty similar to what we're doing. As a matter of fact, their cutbacks that they're trying to address at the county level, I think are very close to the number we're trying to deal with as well. And it's not surprising because our budgets are of similar size. So we're all in the same boat. I'd be surprised if every municipality is not going through these. The only difference with us is we do it very transparently. We don't ever go into executive sessions or closed meetings, et cetera, to have these discussions. We do it all out in the open. So, warts and all, it's a very difficult process, but that's what we did. Any further questions? Well, like I said earlier, this is a time for us all to rise to the occasion. I really believe people do the right thing. It is very difficult on everybody. I don't think the difficult part is going to be over real soon, but we are going to get through this. We are going to make good decisions, and we are going to preserve the city. We're going to preserve the healthcare benefits for the vast majority of our employees. And we are going to preserve income, and we're going to do the very best we can. And I thank everybody for their understanding and tolerance in these really, really difficult times. And I've said this before to you, I thank you all for doing your work in keeping this message out there. Because as I said, it's incredibly important for the public to be fully and honestly informed about this and to speak with one voice. I get as exasperated as you watching the news conferences I see on TV where one person is saying, oh, there might be a second wave, and the other person is saying, no, no way there's going to be a second wave, one state is saying, oh, we can all go back to work, and other states are saying, no, we can't go back. Well, what is it, right? We need to be frank with the American public, and I'm incredibly impressed with the citizens of Plattsburgh really rising to the occasion based on good information. So thank you all for helping with that. Thank you.
Thank you.